Hello and welcome to NewsClick. Today we have with us Dr. Satyajit Rath from National Institute of Immunology to discuss what has been hotly put across by the media as the case of the Superbug, NDM1. Satyajit, how dangerous is this Superbug and what is its genesis?
Let's get certain things clear. In the first place, there's a certain amount of confusion in this entire mess. So NDM1 is not a bug. NDM1 is a gene. The gene is carried on a piece of DNA that can migrate from bacterial species to bacterial species, and whichever bacterium it is in, it will confer resistance to a fairly broad spectrum of antibiotics that are normally used. So obviously, purely from that description, it's a problem. It's a relatively recently discovered gene. I think the first report was less than a year ago, or the report characterizing it was less than a year ago. And in the subsequent period, there have been a large number of reports of infections in which this gene has been found. Many of them are anecdotal reports, 1 case, 5 cases, 10, 20 cases from across the world, a few more perhaps from India, but from other places also. The most recent publication which has generated the most controversy is the one in one of the Lancet journals, which has reported a large series of cases from a number of places, and it appears to link most of these cases, not all of them, but most of them, to the South Asian subcontinent, implying that it may have arisen here and may have by now spread fairly widely globally. So as an antibiotic resistance gene which confers resistance to many antibiotics, it's a threat. However, we have to appreciate something about this notion of superbug. What we mean by superbug is a bug that kills in ordinary conversation, because that's really what we would be concerned about as ordinary people. Does antibiotic resistance make a bug that kills? Well, clearly the answer is no, because if you look at NDM1, of all the cases, and by now there are hundreds of cases, from which NDM1 carrying bacteria have been identified, so far only one has died. Everybody else is fine. On the other hand, for public health purposes, the spread of an antibiotic resistance gene amongst bacterial populations is certainly cause for major concern. And I therefore think that we need to make nuanced distinctions in our response to these sorts of discoveries. And I suspect, as in many other cases, that we have signally failed to make these nuances.
Do you think a part of the description of the superbug, etc., is also to sensationalize the case and perhaps argue, which the Lancet paper in its conclusion seems to do, that medical tourism to India is fraught with a lot of danger?
Think about it this way. The gene is called New Delhi metallobeta-lactamase. Metallobeta-lactamases are a whole family of antibiotic resistance conferring molecules. This one is called the New Delhi version. Now, it wasn't isolated in New Delhi. It wasn't isolated from a patient who had incontrovertibly gotten it in New Delhi. It wasn't reported by anybody in New Delhi. So one could say that it's unfair that it has sullied the name of this fair city to the extent that the city is fair. On the other hand, it's just a name. Usme kya badi baat hai? The Lancet paper similarly, it reports data that are very straightforward data that are no surprise to anybody working in public health in the country. All said and done, we have been crying ourselves hoarse as health activists and responsible medical communities in the country that across the counter unsupervised usage and availability and usage of any antibiotic you care to name is making India extremely susceptible to inadequate doses of antibiotics being taken by people, and therefore the generation of antibiotic resistance in bacterial populations. Therefore, that antibiotic resistance genes of new kinds are seen in South Asia is not going to be any surprise to anybody, and it amuses me a little sadly that we are going to such pains to claim that this is not necessarily Indian. On the other hand, the Lancet paper also goes on and speculates that this may be a reason why going to India for any medical purposes may be problematic. It does therefore begin to lend credence, at least, to claims that are being made within India indignantly, that this is against medical tourism industry. On the other hand, I'm not sure that medical tourism industry is a particularly worthwhile industry for the country. I'm not sure that health should at all be treated as an industry.
Well, there has also been the argument that the stock of antibiotics is of limited use increasingly, and we are going to go back to a pre-antibiotic era, in which case infections will not be able to treat infections, particularly hospital infections. Do you think that's really a serious issue? Or do you think, on the other hand, the fact that we are seeing so few new antibiotics emerge is basically a commentary on how research in pharmaceuticals is being done?
This is a fear that has always been with us, that we will one day run out of antibiotics, because bacteria, remember, bacteria, many of these bacteria of common infections that we deal with divide every 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So, for them to generate large populations with some variation from which these resistance characteristics emerge is a matter of fairly short periods of time. So, bacterial resistance, antibiotic resistance is always going to be with us. We've known this for decades now. Antibiotics tend to target biochemical processes of bacteria that they don't share with us, so that we hope that the antibiotic will specifically affect the bacterium but not affect human cells. Now, we found a few processes, and over the past few decades, the pharmaceutical industry has essentially focused on these processes and found drug after drug after drug after drug. To a certain extent, this has worked. All said and done, we have a fair number of antibiotics. Even NDM1 carrying bacteria, for example, many of them are sensitive to 1, 2 or 3 known antibiotics, one of them actually of very ancient vintage. Are we running out of antibiotics? Not really. What we are running out of is an industrial R&D model that comes up with new antibiotics. We've had successes within the system, as it were, and many people, even within the industry today, agree that that model is proving incapable of responding rapidly by doing high-risk work, by taking on things that are not perhaps patentable properly, and therefore you cannot get exclusive rights on, and a variety of other ways of generating new intervention points in bacterial biochemistry for creating antibiotics, and of looking at new structures of chemical molecules to use in the creation of antibiotics. So, rather than this being either a millennial point that so far and hereafter there is darkness, I suspect that what this is going to lead to eventually, in sort of slow motion death fashion, is the death of the present model of making new drugs for the industry.
Which is highly centralized in a few big pharmaceutical companies and also very highly protected by patents. So, effectively, that is the kind of model which seems to be in danger against what would be possible today, far more collaborative and open model of science.
Within a cartel of that kind, your inclination is to take very low risks. Essentially, what you do is take an antibiotic that works, tinker with it, make it a little better. You get a new set of patents, you get new revenue generation opportunities, you're fine. You haven't spent a great deal of money. So, in all of this, therefore, this tendency to doing low-risk work for the development of new drugs, particularly for something that is likely to be needed as rapidly evolving as possible, as antibiotics, the low-risk model has its saturation point, I suspect, and we are beginning to approach that. And in that sense, the open source model, as one example, is a high-risk model. So is the small cutting-edge biotech entrepreneurial industrial model, which is also a high-risk model. And these models are likely to come into their own.
So in the Darwinian battle between the antibiotics and the germs, what is looking like to fail is actually a model of science, which is what you call the low risk but high cartel model of science.
What is likely to fail is not a model of science, but a model of application of technology. And the application of technology model, as always, connects to the economic system that it is contained in.
So thanks, Satyajit. This has been very illuminating for at least people like us who are a little fazed by this New Delhi beta-lactamase. Thank you very much.
Thank you.